Energy is still being discussed very much as an energy topic, and the renewable sector is not seen sufficiently as the industrial sector of the future that will allow basically to address the energy security issue, allow to address climate change, but also offer real economic opportunities if we build local value.
Today, the world is in the midst of a global energy crisis that is disrupting supply and demand patterns and that is fracturing long-standing trading relations and our hopes for a fast and reliable, sustainable, clean energy transition the world over. From the heart of COP, I am very happy to welcome Rana Adib, Executive Director of REN21, the world's top multi-stakeholder and policy network on renewable energy. Rana, I want to know from you, how does the current geopolitical situation impact the speed and effectiveness of a fair, sustainable energy transition?
Thank you very much, Shireen, for the invitation. Yes, indeed. I think we see today that, unfortunately, being at COP, we need to say unfortunately, the CO2 emissions are going up, and the opportunity which we thought COVID would be in terms of accelerating the uptake of renewable energy and reduce the use of fossil fuel has really been impacted by the current geopolitical situation, whether it is the energy situation or the economic situation. There are two questions which we see here. One is really that because of the pressure and the energy security questions, lots of governments seem to forget that they have signed the Paris Agreement, which is legally binding, and that they need to work towards phasing out fossil fuel and reduce the CO2 emissions. So they are basically ramping up again natural gas use, natural gas infrastructure, and even coal. So that is something which is critical. We see, however, also that the current energy crisis is a real opportunity. Why is this? The energy prices of fossil fuel are fluctuating. They are increasing, and as a result, basically investing in energy efficiency and in renewable energy is even more viable. It's also an opportunity for securing the energy supply. And we see, for instance, that corporations clearly see this as an opportunity to address basically their energy cost.
Now, we saw in the past days a lot of talk about new agreements, especially with some African countries, regarding energy mining, basically. And from parts of the world where we felt they were really champions traditionally of renewables. Is there a duality there, or is there a contradiction? And how dangerous is that kind of talk during this COP?
So to be honest, I think it's really something which is quite challenging to address, and it's not black and white, to be honest. Why is this the case? Energy is fundamental for any economic activities we have, for many of our societal activities. And obviously when we're speaking for countries and population that do not yet have access for energy, energy access is a priority. Now, this is very clearly used as an argument very much of some governments to say, like, we need fossil fuel for, and in particular natural gas, for our economic development. The reality, however, is renewable energy can very clearly supply basically this part, supply basic energy services, but also fuel the economies of Africa. They can provide jobs. They can provide opportunities for manufacturing, and some countries on the African continent have clearly identified this. There are some leading countries, whether it is Kenya, Namibia, South Africa, to some extent Morocco, who clearly see that renewable energy is today the opportunity for economic development, for industrialization, to build up manufacturing of green products, but also to produce green hydrogen and export it into industrialized countries, into Europe, for instance, where there is not enough space and probably less renewable energy potential. So I think it's basically both sides. Unfortunately, and I think this is where REN21 is very active on bringing other voices to the table, we hear the dominant voices very often, and the dominant voices are still natural gas voices, fossil fuel voices. And it would be really interesting to hear like mini-grid developers in Nigeria, for instance, are replacing diesel generators by solar mini-grids, and this allows to reduce the cost by 30%. And if you think about all the diesel generators, and here, I mean, we're in Sharm el-Sheikh, there are diesel generators everywhere, the potential it means in terms of not only CO2 emissions, but also in terms of cost reduction. So the answer is it's challenging times, but there are really good stories and inspiring voices we need to bring to the table so that we really shape basically the energy game.
What you said now just leads us really to two questions. One of them is about fair transitions, but up first I'll ask about demand and supply and demand. Do you believe that we will soon, or in the near future, we would see the renewable energies satisfying the industrial energy needs of the developed world, especially maybe in Europe, given the current situation?
To be honest, I think it's not a question of renewable energy in the near future, yes or no, because renewable energy, the technology is there. The technology only waits for being deployed. I mean, let's be honest, and I think that's a very strong statement, and there is still myth out there. If you listen to the latest IEA reports, in their scenarios, 50% of the CO2 emissions can be reduced with existing technologies. And energy efficiency and renewable energy are part of it. And so we speak about mature technology that can just be deployed. It's the question, which is a question of time, is it the ambition, but it's not only the ambition, it is also about building basically the markets and the market rules, and also for governments to understand that they need today to apply and develop industrial policy, financial policies, skilling policies in the same manner as they have done this in the past for other technologies and industrial sectors. And that is something which I think we see is still not very well seen.
Why?
Why? To be honest, I still think we do not see the urgency. If we were really serious, see, and I must say, we have seen a massive mobilization of governments for COVID. We have seen a massive mobilization now in the current energy security crisis. We need exactly the same mobilization for the deployment for the energy transition. And the reality here, for instance, I just think in Europe today, there is a skilling gap. And you need to wait for many, many months. You have your solar plant, you get a heat pump, etc. If governments were taking this really seriously, they could, for instance, mandate military to install such things. They could mandate or decide...
Because it is a crisis.
Yeah, it is a
does
crisis.
require that kind of action.
It is a crisis that required that kind of action. And I still think energy is still being discussed very much as an energy topic. And the renewable sector is not seen sufficiently as the industrial sector of the future. That will allow basically to address the energy security issues, allow to address climate change, but also offer real economic opportunities if we build local value. And I think this is important obviously in Europe, but it's also important in many developing and emerging economies, because here is the possibility to basically build energy for the country itself, but also develop goods and spread the economic development throughout the society and all activities. So no, the crisis, I think we still don't treat basically this situation as a crisis.
Do you think what we are experiencing currently would take us a few steps back rather than forward?
I think there is a risk for it, but I also see. So yes, I think there is a risk. There is a risk because we see that players are ready to compromise on their engagement, on the long-term engagements. Ultimately, I must say, however, and even in Europe, you see, like, or especially in Europe, this also creates an opportunity for accelerating. We clearly see that there is a development of energy efficiency, heat pumps much more. When you look at the development of those markets here, there is an understanding, and it's often actually not only the governments pushing, but it might be citizens pushing, cities pushing, industry pushing. And coming from a multi-stakeholder voice, I think this is actually what we need to do. We need to bring those voices to the table and really say, like, we need the energy transition, and we do not need the energy transition only for climate reasons, but we need the energy transition because it allows us to build a fairer society also. And yeah.
Well, we live in a world where energy access, especially in Africa and the least developed countries, is still a major issue. And the current trajectory suggests that there is a tendency to even encourage fossil fuel exploration in some of these countries. How do you see that, and what to do about it? I mean, you have a double-edged sword here. Hey, there are resources that are not very good for the planet, but they can promise energy access in countries that don't have energy access, but really this is about exporting those elsewhere. Are we being hypocritical, or is it necessity? And what is the prioritization? I mean, you touched upon that a little bit, but let's just face it head on.
To be honest, I think there are, again, we speak about quite complex topics here. I think so first, just to put this in perspective again, for the first year since 2013, the amount of people not having access to electricity has increased again. We have reached 770 million people today do not have access to electricity. So this is obviously something which is extremely worrying. It also shows, let's be honest, that natural gas is actually, or fossil fuel, has not been enough in the past to provide this full energy access. And I think that is something which we really need to keep in mind. Now, when it comes to energy access, I think there are two things. We know, for instance, that decentralized renewable energy is able, whether it is mini-grids, for instance, they can provide a 24/7-hour energy service to villages, to homes, but also fuel economic activities. Deploying mini-grids is much quicker than basically deploying a whole fossil fuel infrastructure. And the reality also is, and there are numbers for it, that building today new fossil fuel infrastructure means building actually investments or investing money into infrastructure and projects where you know exactly that they will need to end in a very short time. They will become vested waste stranded assets. So, and this is basically a pressure, a financial pressure, governments in Africa cannot take. I think this is one part. And then I would agree on this part, we see a big hype of industrialized countries looking obviously at the massive potential of renewable energy in Africa for the objective of exporting. And I think this is where we clearly need to acknowledge the fact that renewable energy is extremely powerful. Renewable sources exist everywhere in the world. They are an opportunity to make basically our energy system independent of fossil fuel players, but they require investment into infrastructure, investment into manufacturing, etc. And what is important is that this investment is invested in a way that it allows for local value creation as much as for exports. And here, let's be honest, we will need to review some of the principles of the World Trade Organization's because it's about establishing trade agreements, industrial agreements that are probably different than what we have been used to. There is an interesting momentum because the interruption on all the supply chains, also in Europe, in the US, etc., have clearly raised the awareness for the need to really ensure local, regional supply chains. So I think there is an interesting development to expect.
How optimistic are you in terms of reaching 2030 targets? And how do you explain the current stagnation in the renewable energy markets?
So how optimistic am I? I think again it's a matter of will, it's a matter of deployment, it's a matter of deployment rate, and it's a matter of investment. So the ambition is not enough anymore. We need concrete action. And I think where I'm reassured is I know actually that the technology is there and only waits for being deployed. So where I am worried is I still see a lacking coordination and really the urgency is still not there, even though there are the solutions. And this is something which makes me rather pessimistic, I guess, in terms of reaching the 2030 targets. I feel that at this COP, where it needs to be on action very much, where it needs to be about deployment, it's really important that we do not only look at the 2050 targets, but at 2030 targets. Because if we don't manage to work toward those rather short-term targets now, we might just really take a massive risk for humankind. And I don't think that anybody here in the room wants this.
Rana Deep, thank you. It was a pleasure having you with us today.
Thank you very much, Shireen.